The floor was the first thing and the last thing. It was a map of her life, a testament to her father's belief that a foundation was not a metaphor. It was oak, laid down a century ago, and it had borne the weight of generations. The frantic scuff of Prohibition-era dances, the slow shuffle of Depression-era breadlines her grandfather had run from the kitchen, the confident stride of post-war optimism, and now the tired tread of her own worn-soled shoes. Elena knew every scar, every ghost stain, every board that groaned a specific note of complaint. She had spent the better part of her 40 years on her hands and knees learning its language. Tonight it was clean. Not just swept, but scrubbed with vinegar and hot water until the old wood gave off a scent of forest floor after a hard rain. It was a clean that was a form of prayer, a ritual of order against the chaos of the city outside. The salt was a desecration. Outside, the November sky wept a miserable, sleeting rain that froze on the asphalt and turned the world into a treacherous sheet of gray. The restaurant, Trattoria Rossi, was an island of warmth, smelling of garlic simmering in olive oil, of yeast and old wine, of Elena's obsessive cleanliness. It was 9 o'clock. The last of the dinner patrons, a young couple celebrating an anniversary with trembling hands and shared tiramisu, had just departed, leaving behind a small constellation of cake crumbs and a generous tip. She was alone, save for Marco, her nephew, a lanky 17-year-old who washed dishes with the sullen, rhythmic grace of a teenager who would rather be anywhere else. The hum of the ancient refrigerator was the restaurant's resting heartbeat. The plink, plink, plink of a slow leak in the kitchen faucet was its quiet clock. Elena was wiping down the last table, her movements economical and precise, a discipline learned at her father's side. He had been a chef, but also a philosopher of motion. Waste nothing, he would say, not a carrot top, not a heel of bread, not a single step. Every gesture should have a purpose. Her life had become a study in that principle. The bell over the door chimed, a harsh, unwelcome sound that shattered the evening's fragile peace. It was not the gentle jingle of a returning regular. It was a clang, as if the door had been thrown open rather than pushed. 3 men filled the doorway, bringing the biting cold and the city's grime in with them. They were large men, built of cheap suits and cheaper confidence. Their shoulders were too wide for the entrance, forcing them to enter one by one, a clumsy parade of predators seeking shelter. They stomped their feet on the welcome mat, but it was a perfunctory gesture. They were not trying to be clean. They were announcing their arrival. Their wet wool coats smelled of damp earth and stale cigar smoke. They moved like they owned any space they entered, their eyes scanning the empty room not for a table, but for threats, for assets, for dominance. They were sharks in a fishbowl, too big, too dangerous for the quiet dignity of the place. And with every heavy step they took toward the center of the room, their thick-soled boots left a trail of melting slush and coarse white rock salt. A gritty, crystalline smear across the dark, gleaming oak. A violation. Elena stopped wiping the table. She placed the damp cloth down, folding it into a perfect square. Her hands, usually in constant, purposeful motion, became still. She watched the salt crystals glitter under the warm, low light. Each one was an insult. A tiny monument to their carelessness, their disrespect. Marco poked his head through the service window from the kitchen, his eyes wide. He saw the men. Then he saw his aunt's back, rigid as a steel rod. He knew that stillness. It was the calm at the center of a storm. The men didn't notice her at first. They were talking amongst themselves in low, gravelly voices, their laughter a wet, ugly sound. They were deciding where to sit, as if the choice were a matter of tactical importance. One of them pointed a thick finger toward a large booth in the corner. She didn't like the way they'd tracked salt across her clean floor, and she said so loud enough for the whole dining room to hear. Her voice was not a shout. It was clear, calm, and carried the absolute authority of a person standing on their own ground. It cut through their guttural conversation like a razor. I just washed that floor. The 3 men stopped. They turned to look at her, their expressions shifting from casual arrogance to mild surprise, then to amusement. She was a small woman, made smaller by the cavernous emptiness of the room. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her plain black apron was spotless. She looked like what she was, a tired woman at the end of a long day in a small, family-owned restaurant. She was nothing. The one in the middle, the clear leader of the trio, smirked. A gold tooth flashed in the corner of his mouth. It was a small, ugly sun. He looked down at the floor, then back at her. So wash it again. His tone was dismissive, a master swatting at a fly. His two companions chuckled, a sound like rocks grinding together. They started to move again, turning their backs on her. The matter settled in their minds. But the matter was not settled. Elena did not move. She did not flinch. She simply stood there, a fixed point of defiance in the warm, quiet room. The bell over the door chimed again, this time with a softer, more deliberate sound. A fourth man had entered, but he was nothing like the others. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and left out in the wind. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored overcoat that fell to his ankles. There was no slush on his polished black shoes. He had wiped them carefully and completely on the mat outside. He moved with a profound stillness, his presence absorbing the light and sound in the room rather than reflecting it. The air grew heavier, denser. His eyes, the color of dark, cold water, swept over the scene. They noted his men, their oafish posture, the smirks on their faces. They noted the trails of salt on the immaculate floor. And they noted the small, unmoving woman standing by the table. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than was necessary. He saw not a servant. He saw a bulwark. He was the Dawn. The other three fell silent the moment they sensed him behind them. Their bodies tensed, their clumsy arrogance deflating like a punctured tire. They turned, their faces a mixture of deference and fear. He gave them a look. It was not a glare. It was a flat, emotionless assessment, and it was more terrifying than any rage. The man with the gold tooth seemed to shrink, his shoulders hunching. The Don looked at his men, jerked his head toward the door, and followed her to a two-top in the back without a single word of protest. The three thugs stumbled over themselves to exit, their retreat as graceless as their entrance. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving only the cold silence and the man who commanded it. He chose the table himself, the smallest one, tucked into a shadowed corner by the kitchen door. It was a table for ghosts, for quick, lonely meals, not for a man of his stature. He slid into the chair, his movements fluid, economical. He did not remove his coat. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, palms down. They were large, clean hands, the nails impeccably cared for. The hands of a surgeon or a strangler. He was a statue in the empty restaurant, a monument to a power so absolute it required no performance. Elena watched him. She had seen men like him before, from a distance. Men who moved through the world as if it were a current, and they were the unmoving stone that parted it. They carried an aura of deep, cold gravity. Her father had called them men of weight. Be careful of men of weight, he'd told her once, his hands kneading dough with a practiced rhythm. They bend the world around them. Stand too close, and they will bend you, too. She picked up her cloth and walked not to his table, but to the center of the room. She knelt, her knees protesting with a soft crackle, and began to wipe away the streaks of salt and grime. She worked methodically, her strokes even and firm, erasing the violation. She was not just cleaning a floor. She was reclaiming her territory, re-establishing the border between her world of order and their world of chaos. The man in the corner watched her, his expression unreadable. He did not rush her. He did not speak. He simply waited, granting her the silence and the time to restore her domain. It was a form of respect, more profound than any apology. When the floor was clean again, restored to its dark, humble glory, she rose. She washed her hands at the small service sink behind the bar, the water running hot over her knuckles. She dried them on a clean linen towel. Only then did she approach his table. He had not moved a muscle. He looked up at her as she stopped beside him, his gaze level and assessing. It was not the leering look of a man at a woman, nor the dismissive glance of a customer at a waitress. It was the look of a jeweler examining a rare, strange stone. He was trying to understand its composition, its hardness, its hidden fire. She met his gaze without fear. In her own restaurant, she was sovereign. "What can I get for you?" Her voice was steady. It was the question of a proprietor, not a servant. He considered the question for a long moment, as if she had asked him to solve a complex philosophical problem. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Marco, still hiding in the kitchen, peered through the diamond-shaped window in the door, his face pale. He could feel the tension from 20 feet away. It was a low hum in the air, the vibration of a plucked string about to snap. Finally, the man spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Coffee. Black." It was a command, but it was delivered with the quiet courtesy of a request. She nodded once. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, her back straight. She did not hurry. In her world, he might be a man of weight, but she controlled the heat, the cold, the fire. She controlled the coffee. And in that small, simple fact, she found a perfect, unshakable balance. The coffee machine was an old Fiamma, a chrome and brass beast her father had bought second-hand in the 70s. It hissed and gurgled like a sleeping dragon. Elena measured the beans, her motions a familiar ritual. She ground them fresh, the whir of the grinder the only sound in the kitchen, a stark contrast to the profound silence in the dining room. The aroma filled the small space, rich and dark and earthy. It was a smell of sanity, of routine. She tamped the grounds, locked the portafilter into place, and pulled the shot. The espresso streamed out, a thick, hazel-brown crema crowning the black liquid. She poured it into a small, heavy ceramic cup and added hot water from the machine's spout. An Americano, strong and uncompromising. She placed the cup on a saucer, added a small silver spoon, and carried it out. He was exactly as she had left him, a study in absolute stillness. She set the coffee down in front of him. The clink of the ceramic on the wooden table was unnervingly loud. He did not thank her. He simply wrapped his large hand around the small cup, his fingers dwarfing it. The heat did not seem to bother him. He raised it to his lips and took a sip, his eyes never leaving hers. He tasted it, his expression unchanging. He was not merely drinking coffee. He was analyzing it, deconstructing its flavor profile, judging its quality. "Good," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a verdict. A statement of fact from a man who dealt only in them. He took another sip. Elena stood by the table, her arms crossed. She would not be dismissed. This was her space, and he was a guest in it until he left. The silent standoff continued. A war of wills fought in the space between them. She was a rock. He was the sea. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the air. Then the night broke again. This time, it was not the chime of the bell. It was the squeal of tires on the icy street outside, followed by the slamming of car doors. Not one, but two. Loud, angry voices echoed from the sidewalk, raw and uncultured. Marco's face, still pressed to the window, went white. "These are not the same men," his look seemed to scream. "These are worse." Elena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The man in the corner, Mr. Volkov, as she would later learn his name was, did not react. He took another slow sip of his coffee, as if he were listening to a distant, uninteresting piece of music. But Elena saw it, a subtle tightening of the muscles around his jaw. a new, deeper coldness in his eyes. The storm had followed him here, and he had let it straight through her door, across her clean floor, and into the fragile sanctuary of her life. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, shaking a framed photograph of her parents. It was a picture of them on their wedding day, smiling, standing in this very room. The frame tilted, askew. The violation was immediate, personal. 4 men spilled into the restaurant. They were younger than Volkov's crew, dressed in flashy, ill-fitting tracksuits and heavy gold chains. They moved with a twitchy, nervous energy, a desperation that made them far more dangerous than the lumbering thugs who had preceded them. Their leader was a wiry man with a puckered scar that ran from the corner of his eye to his lip, pulling his mouth into a permanent, snarling sneer. His eyes were small and black, like chips of obsidian. They darted around the room, taking in its emptiness, before landing on the solitary figure in the back corner. The scar-faced man grinned, a triumphant, ugly expression. "Look what we have here," he said, his voice a nasal whine that grated on the nerves. Old man Volkov, hiding in a pasta joint. He and his men fanned out, their movements sloppy but effective, cutting off any potential escape. They were hyenas cornering a lion, emboldened by numbers and their own foolish arrogance. They had not yet registered Elena. She was part of the scenery, a piece of furniture. Their focus was entirely on the still figure at the back table. Volkov placed his coffee cup down on its saucer with deliberate care. The sound was a period at the end of a sentence. He did not rise. He did not speak. He simply watched them approach, his body relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He was a predator at rest, conserving energy, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The scar-faced man swaggered forward, his cronies flanking him. They were a wall of cheap cologne and menace. He stopped a few feet from Volkov's table. "Getting slow, old man? My boss, Mr. Petrov, he sends his regards. He says your time is over." He reached into his jacket, his intentions clear. But before he could produce whatever weapon he was carrying, his eyes caught on a slight movement near the kitchen door. It was Marco. Terrified, the boy had taken a half step back, knocking a stack of clean plates from a nearby shelf. The crash was explosive in the tense silence. Porcelain shattered, skittering across the floor like shrapnel. Marco froze, his face a mask of pure terror. The hyenas turned their attention to the new sound, their predatory instincts diverted. The scar-faced man's sneer widened. "Well, what's this? A little kitchen rat." He took a step toward Marco, his intentions shifting from business to cruel amusement. "Leave the kid alone." The words were Elena's. They were quiet, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. The 4 men turned to look at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The scar-faced man laughed, a short, barking sound. "Who the hell are you? The cleaning lady?" He took another step toward Marco, who was trembling, paralyzed by fear. The man reached out and shoved the boy hard against the wall. Marco's head hit the plaster with a dull thud. "Get back in the kitchen, rat, before I step on you." That was the moment the world shifted. It was not a choice. It was a chemical reaction, an imperative encoded in her DNA. Her father's face flashed in her mind. Not his smiling wedding portrait, but his face in the hospital bed, pale and shrunken. His strong hands which had built this restaurant and this life, lying limp on the white sheets. He had been broken by men like these. Not with fists, but with contracts and lawyers and threats whispered over the phone. A systemic violence that had crushed his spirit and stopped his heart. They had taken his restaurant, his legacy, and left him with nothing but debt and shame. It had taken Elena 10 years of working 2 jobs, saving every penny to buy it back, to restore this one small piece of her father's world. This floor, this room, this sanctuary. They were not just threatening a boy. They were not just menacing a customer. They were trying to break her world all over again. And that was not going to happen. She didn't look at Volkov. This was not his fight. He was a guest, and the first rule of the house was that the house protected its own. She took a step forward, away from the bar and into the open space of the dining room. Her body settled into a state of calm she hadn't felt in years. It was the calm of purpose. The calm of a blade that has found its line. It began with a memory, sharp and vivid as the day it was made. She was 12 years old, standing on a stool in her father's sweltering kitchen. He was teaching her how to break down a whole pig. His hands, dusted with flour and stained with beet juice, moved with a surgeon's precision. He placed a heavy cleaver in her hand. "This is not about strength, Elena," he had said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "A butcher is not a brute. He is an artist. He understands the animal. He knows where the joints are, where the muscle gives way. He does not fight the body. He persuades it. He tapped his temple with a floury finger. It is all here. Balance. Leverage. Respect for the tool." That day, she had learned more than butchery. She had learned about anatomy, about the weak points in a structure, about the devastating efficiency of a well-placed blade applied with knowledge instead of rage. The kitchen was his classroom, and its lessons were about life. "A kitchen is a world," he'd told her, his eyes serious. "You are its god. You control the heat, the cold, the steel, the fire. Never let anyone else command your kitchen. This was her kitchen. This was her world." The memory faded, but the lesson remained, humming in her blood. She was no longer Elena Rossi, tired restaurateur. She was her father's daughter. Her first move was not toward the men. It was toward the pass-through window to the kitchen. On the heated shelf, waiting for a customer who would never arrive, sat a cast-iron skillet of sizzling garlic shrimp. The pan was black iron, heavy and perfectly seasoned. The oil within it was shimmering, just shy of its smoke point. She wrapped a thick service napkin around the handle. Her movements were fluid, devoid of hesitation. The scar-faced man and his crew were still focused on Marco, enjoying his fear. They had dismissed her completely. It was their second mistake of the evening. Their first was coming through her door. She crossed the 10 feet of dining room floor in 4 silent steps. The man who had shoved Marco was closest. His back was to her. He was laughing, saying something vile to the terrified boy. Elena didn't say a word. She swung the skillet in a short, powerful arc, not with the brute force of her arms, but with the coiled torque of her entire body. A pivot of the hips that was pure, practiced technique. The bottom of the heavy pan connected with the back of the man's knee. There was a sickening, wet crunch. It was the sound of a joint being persuaded to bend in a direction it was never meant to go. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony, and collapsed, clutching his ruined leg. The scorching hot garlic oil sloshed from the pan, spattering across the back of his neck. His scream deepened into a raw shriek of pain. The other 3 spun around, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. They saw her, standing over their fallen comrade, the empty, smoking skillet held at the ready in one hand. She was not a waitress. She was something else entirely. Something they did not have a name for. The scar-faced leader recovered first, his shock curdling into rage. He lunged at her, pulling a cheap switchblade from his pocket. The blade snapped open with a metallic click. She did not retreat. She stepped into his attack, using his own momentum against him. As he slashed wildly, she dropped the skillet, its clatter echoing on the floorboards. Her left hand shot out, not to block the knife, but to grab his wrist, her fingers finding the precise pressure point her father had shown her on a pig's foreleg. His grip loosened involuntarily. His eyes widened in pained surprise. At the same time, her right hand, now free, snatched a wine bottle from the nearest table. A heavy, full-bodied Chianti. She brought it down, not on his head, a crude and inefficient target, but on his collarbone. The bottle didn't break. The impact was a dull, solid thud, like a hammer hitting a side of beef. A sharp crack followed. The man's arm went limp, the switchblade clattering to the floor. He staggered back, his face white, a silent scream frozen on his lips. He was broken. 2 men remained. They were frozen, their thuggish confidence utterly shattered. They were looking at a demon, a small, quiet woman in a black apron who had dismantled their 2 toughest members in less than 5 seconds. They looked at each other, a silent, panicked communication passing between them. They had come for a lion and found themselves in a spider's web. Elena took a step toward them. She didn't pick up a weapon. She didn't need one. Her eyes were flat, her expression devoid of emotion. It was this emptiness that terrified them most. It was not anger. It was purpose. "Go," she said. The word was not a suggestion. It was a command. For a moment they hesitated, caught between the fear of this woman and the fear of returning to their boss empty-handed. She took another step. They broke. They scrambled for the door, tripping over each other in their haste. They grabbed their 2 injured comrades, hauling them up and dragging them out into the cold, wet night. Their retreat was a pathetic, stumbling scramble. The door slammed shut behind them, and then there was silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the ragged, terrified breathing of Marco, still pressed against the wall. The room was a disaster. Shattered plates, an overturned chair, the fallen knife, the discarded skillet. But the threat was gone. The chaos had been met and mastered. Elena stood in the center of the wreckage, her own breathing steady, her hands unclenched at her sides. She bent down, picked up the tilted photograph of her parents, and set it straight. Throughout the entire event, from the shattering of the plates to the final, desperate flight of the thugs, Mr. Volkov had not moved. He remained at his table in the corner, a silent, motionless observer. He had not offered to help. He had not flinched. He had simply watched, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the brief, brutal ballet. He had seen bar fights, back-alley ambushes, and meticulously planned assassinations. They were clumsy, wasteful affairs, full of sound and fury. What he had just witnessed was something else entirely. It was not a fight. It was a dissection. He had watched her move. He saw the way she used the environment, the way she turned everyday objects into devastatingly effective tools. He saw the cold, clear logic in her actions. She did not strike at random. Each movement had a purpose. Each target was chosen for maximum effect with minimum effort. The knee joint, the collarbone, points of structural failure. She hadn't defeated them with strength. She had defeated them with knowledge. It was the work of a professional, executed with the dispassionate precision of a master craftsman. He had assessed her earlier as a woman of unusual integrity, a person who owned her small space with an iron will. He had been wrong. Or rather, he had been incomplete in his assessment. Her integrity was not just a moral quality, it was a physical one. It was a structural principle that governed her every motion. She was not just the owner of this restaurant. She was its guardian, its weapon. He looked at her now, standing in the middle of the room she had just defended. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. There was no tremor in her hands, no wild, adrenalized look in her eyes. There was only a quiet, focused calm. She was a soldier standing on a battlefield she had just won, already assessing the damage, planning the cleanup, restoring the order. He had spent his life surrounded by men who performed power. They wore it like a costume, in their loud voices, their expensive suits, their casual cruelty. It was a hollow, brittle thing. This woman, in her simple apron, possessed an authentic power he had rarely encountered. It was quiet. It was efficient. It was absolute. It was rooted in something real. In her knowledge, in her discipline, in her fierce, uncompromising ownership of her world. He had come here tonight, expecting a confrontation with his rival, Petrov. He had expected to conduct business, to issue threats, to perhaps shed blood. He had not expected to receive a lesson in the true nature of strength. He took a final sip of his coffee. It was cold now, but it didn't matter. He placed the cup back on the saucer, the small click a signal that the performance was over. He had seen what he needed to see. He had not found a pawn or an asset. He had found something far rarer. He had found an equal. The silence that followed was heavy with the ghosts of violence. The smell of fear, a sharp metallic tang, mingled with the lingering aroma of garlic and spilled wine. Marco, finally unfreezing, pushed himself off the wall, his limbs trembling. He looked at his aunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He had known her his whole life as Tia Elena, the woman who made him do his homework, who always smelled of flour and basil, whose quiet disapproval was the most frightening thing in his world. He did not know this woman, this silent, dangerous creature who had just dismantled 4 grown men. Elena's gaze softened as she looked at him. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, unable to speak. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm, grounding. "Go home, Marco. I'll clean this up." He nodded numbly, grabbed his coat, and fled, not looking back. He needed to be somewhere safe, somewhere the world made sense again. Elena watched him go, a flicker of pain in her eyes. The innocence of her restaurant had been shattered tonight, and Marco had been there to see it. It was a loss she felt more keenly than the broken plates. With the boy gone, she turned her attention to the room. It was her nature. When faced with chaos, she created order. She began to pick up the largest pieces of the broken plates, her movements slow and deliberate. She righted the overturned chair. She found the switchblade on the floor and, holding it by the handle with 2 fingers as if it were a dead rat, she dropped it into a metal trash bin, where it landed with a flat, final clatter. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. The mess was not just a physical problem. It was a violation of the spirit of the place, and it had to be purged. Volkov watched her, this strange, formidable woman bringing her world back into alignment, one piece of broken porcelain at a time. He felt an uncharacteristic urge to help, to do something. But he knew it would be an intrusion. This was her ritual, her process. To interfere would be another form of disrespect. So he waited, a silent witness to her quiet, determined restoration. After a few minutes, she stopped. She had gathered the debris into a neat pile. The room was still a wreck, but the process of healing had begun. She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "You brought this to my door." It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, as clear and hard as his verdict on the coffee. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet. "I did." He did not apologize. Apologies were for the weak, for those who made mistakes they could not rectify. He dealt in debts and payments, and a debt had been incurred tonight, a significant one. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a wallet. It was black leather, thin and elegant. From it, he pulled not cash, but a single, thick business card. He slid it across the table toward her. It traveled over the polished wood and came to a stop just at the edge. Elena looked down at it. The card was made of heavy, cream-colored stock. There was no name, no company logo. Just a single phone number embossed in severe black lettering. It was an object of immense weight, a key to a world she had spent her life avoiding. This was not payment for damages. This was not a tip. It was an invitation, an offer, a recognition. She looked up from the card, her eyes meeting his. "What is this?" she asked, though she already knew. "A resource," he said. "You have a problem. You call that number." Any problem. The promise was absolute. It offered a shield, a sword, a force of nature to be summoned with a single call. It was the kind of power her father had never had, the kind of power that could have saved him. She thought of the men who had destroyed him, the men in their sharp suits who had used contracts and courts as their weapons. This card was a weapon of equal or greater force. She did not reach for it. She simply looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "And what is the price?" she asked. "Everything has a price." It was the first lesson of business, the first lesson of life.